Okay, so we're started, and TJ had a video called "The Failure of Feminism," and it was a very lively video. Enjoyed it quite a bit. Said some things that I wanted to get in there, and I think a little bit talk about patriarchy. And for me, and this is we're gonna have a dialogue about this, obviously, as you can see. And for me, the issue is to what degree is what is called patriarchy something that is conscious and something that's driven by men, or can't women be reproducing patriarchy as much as men can? See, I think in his video, and it was so insightful and such an engaging video, but I think part of the problem is that I think there are different waves of feminism, and that some feminists claim that attention to gender equality was really what should be going on, and that they were more concerned about forms of social justice that could be brought about by attention to gender differences and then the way that we understand some of those. But the point would be that it's not just men who reproduce the conditions of patriarchy. It's that men and women, and that patriarchy is almost something like a pre-reflective or a subconscious process, an ongoing historical process that almost appropriates people without them, I guess, feeling themselves as consciously driving it as an over against process. It's not like, when I go in the toolbox and grab a tool and apply it to a process or apply it to a problem, it's very different than when I say that I'm, I guess, engaging in patriarchal practices that systematically, I guess, empower or disenfranchise one or another group systematically. Do you know what I'm saying? So, I mean, I think those are some of the concerns. I mean, just initially the issue about patriarchy was, I think, where I would want to maybe launch into some of the concern.
Yeah, I guess I would come at it from I was just struck by all the different examples, and some of them I think are really apt. Some of them I think are, maybe sort of cherry picked out of possible examples. I mean, birth and custody issues for fathers. It's obviously significant that that there are people who are fighting for men's rights, but there is still the fact of pregnancy, which still happens in the female body. So that kind of undermines some of the arguments towards equality. I mean, equality is one of the virtues in our culture, but it's not the only virtue. There are other virtues like, say, justice, which doesn't necessarily require that men and women are equal along all fronts. I mean, you can have sort of this individualized, separate, there's some women who are very equal to men, especially when you're prepubescent. Little children are very similar in some ways. If you got a really athletic little girl, or you got, a little boy, you almost can't tell the difference. Then puberty hits, then all sorts of things happen. Some of this is socialized, but there's also some differences. And I'm not some kind of essentialist, but I also don't want to completely sweep under the rug some of the realities of the situation of men's and women's bodies. I mean, even comparing female and male circumcision, I think is useful, because I do think people gloss the significance of circumcision, although I have to say that I think from what I've heard, the statistics, the number of people who are having their boy babies circumcised is going down. And part of that is because maybe the hold of the Christianity is loosening up. I mean, they have a feast day for the circumcision of Christ because he was a Jew, and there was the reason that they did it was apparently, I tried to ask people that I know who know all sorts of things about the Jewish religion, and it has something to do with a covenant with God. I don't know. I think maybe in some ways it help to desensitize men sexually by exposing sensitive parts of the body.
Right. See,
so that if you say, why do people do it? At least I want to try and get at the rationale,
okay.
And that might be, who knows, some twisted notion of equality or some kind of religious reason for it, which is different from to say we're going to make a less sexual animal so that then it can focus on philanthropy or praising of God or whatever. I don't agree or disagree with all of that, and I don't even know if that's right. I'm sure maybe some of the Jewish people can chime in on that matter, but the point is that some of these things are shifting a little bit, and part of it is because people are becoming aware of what happens to the human body, and the sort of rationales that existed before don't exist anymore. So I do think in some ways patriarchy has lost a lot of its stranglehold. And I think that that makes sense to point out areas where you see it eroding, but it's not necessarily so hardcore anymore. I mean, women do participate in the military more than they did before. They're not necessarily in combat. They do in other countries. And in the U.S., part of the reason that they haven't been pulled in is because there hasn't been the need. We're not a small country like Israel, which does have female military. And so we lean on the poor. And I think your point about the poor is a really important one. And I think that any feminist worth her salt or his salt would be concerned with poverty and how it mixes in with sexism, just the way that Martin Luther King was not just about race, but was about poverty.
Well, there's so many other forms of inequality that weren't addressed in there at all. And again, this is maybe for his argument. I used to get so angry. I mean, I would be in arguments. I had very similar experiences to what he was expressing when I was in graduate school, where I would just try to bring out some of the what I guess today are called men rights issues, male rights concerns. But I would say, just all kinds of things about, the way Mother's Day is appreciated and the way Father's Day is not appreciated. There's tons and tons of social statistics research on the degree to which women value friendship with other women much more than they value friendship with men. And men value friendship with women actually more than they value with other men. Now, men value friendship, but again, some of this is just broad trends. But in general, the companionship with women is so much more highly sought after than companionship with men. And the fact that, people do have a great celebration of, as I said, Mother's Day in a way that Father's Day is sort of this, dads are kind of on the outside of relations, and yet we do want to recognize relations as being this great, an important part of, an important part of human life. And some of those issues, it would be just dismissed. And I guess, part of that is I don't know where I guess I'm going with all that. I guess the...
You want to hand it over?
Yeah, what would you say?
I'm still on the particulars of the argument because I think some of them are really strong and some of them are not as strong. I mean, I took a feminist class in college and I was accused of being male identified because I was always saying, well, what about this and what about that? And I didn't get a good grade in it and I never really, I was never embraced by the feminist community, although I have some friends who do feminist scholarship and I've written an article or two that fit into that kind of journal. I can appreciate the desire to be a humanist, to say, look, you cannot just look at one variable. There are ways that religion gets involved in this. There are ways that class is hugely a part of it. Like when TJ was talking about maybe 200 years ago, maybe 50 years ago. I mean, there are big changes that happened. 200 years ago, the family was a really different organization, and women in some ways might have been oppressed, but in other cases weren't, because they were all oppressed by, many of them in the U.S. were oppressed, were shaped by their religion. So, women made babies, and that was what they did for agricultural reasons, and it was a good thing to have kids, and so in some ways they were more equal. There was more equality on the agricultural, many-child farm family than there was in the middle class, urban, controlling the number of children. Women had to maintain purity, and men were trying to negotiate their sexuality. Household in the 1800s. So even historically, you see things kind of rise and fall, and you see power being held or not held. You see men, subjected to the kinds of systems. I mean, in the 1800s, men were told to conserve their sexual energy, and there was a lot of continence and abstinence, and a lot of frustration, and a lot of generating, your energies into other things.
But I mean, I think there is a reality about, okay, I'm going to go back to patriarchy for the other argument. I think there is though a patriarchy that there are patriarchal forces. I mean, you could do the matrilineal versus patrilineal orders of understanding, just in earlier tribal societies, of trying to understand relationships. And then it started to become questions of who became the proper successor to inheritance. So, I mean, part of this has to do with inheritance structures. But I think the problem of property and of land ownership and it's partly if you have multiple children, if it's male or female. See, I don't think he was talking maybe enough about the way that males and females are valued differently in certain cultures, and then how property rights have come into effect with that. Yeah, again, we could talk about forms of social justice there and forms of equality. But I guess, I mean, the question for me still goes back to what extent is patriarchy first actually consciously chosen? Is it more like habits and practices, traditions that are more thoughtlessly reproduced, and they're the conditions by which consciousness comes to itself, rather than some tool or some process that we apply? See, I think there was a sort of a way of thinking about it that was making it seem as if only men could be patriarchal, as if it's something that a male does, it's patriarchal, or if it's something that serves a male interest, whereas it could be that patriarchy is more of it's a set of ongoing historical traditions and practices and assumptions that no one is really consciously thinking about, but males and females equally. It has to do with the way they defer to forms of authority, forms of reasoning that seem less than reasonable, that they seem to bring about forms of injustice or forms of what we want to say, well, that's really not fair or something.
Well, part of the difficulty is that or not difficulty, it's just the sign of the times. There's not as much community, I think, in like real kind of pressure-y community where you take your marching orders from the church, which everybody in your town does, or you take your marching orders from the
exclusion
community.
of women in the church would be a great example. The exclusion of women in politics. I mean, those are pretty solid examples of women being disenfranchised from the public sphere. I mean, it has a lot to do with the difference between women have a privilege in the private sphere and men have a privilege in the public sphere. I think that's some of the way that gets shaken out, at least.
Well, and that's old school style too. I mean, it really depends on your household. It depends on your family. It depends on your community. People who are recent immigrants who come from other countries and other cultures are still sort of subjected to those expectations. My grandmother still asks me what I'm cooking tonight, this kind of thing. I mean,
right.
So, I live on my own, and I'm old enough now that I can sort of go, that's cute that she keeps pressuring me, but part of me is still irritated by it. And it's, this isn't a guy who's telling me what I should do. Men that I know don't particularly care whether I cook or not, but, I get this kind of thing because
that's
she comes from an era and from a,
a
community where it's very odd not to do such things all the time as the woman,
right.
and pressures to be the breadwinner, which is the pressure that patriarchy puts on men.
So is there such a thing? I mean, let's push TJ's issue though. So is there such a thing as patriarchy? I mean, first off, there is no such thing. It's a noise that comes out of our mouth, and it's an abstraction. But is there some justification in making such an abstraction? I mean, can we justify it? Is there enough form there? I mean, how does chivalry fit into patriarchy? I mean, is it part of it or antithetical to it?
I wouldn't even go there. I mean,
well, see, I know. Well, I mean,
I don't see that there's a whole lot of chivalry going on these days.
Okay,
there's bigger examples of where patriarchy is still in play.
Well, you don't think that the idea of a guy sacrificing himself in war, or you don't think chivalry is still in play? This, I feel, come on.
Well, no, I mean, I'm not denying
like
that.
Right now, if there would be a fire and some guy would leave without trying to take care, let the women and children first. If it wouldn't be a women and children first, you don't think that would be less than seen as a guy who is self-serving in front of a woman, not holding the door for a woman? He's rude, whereas a woman who doesn't hold for a door for a guy, she's not seen as rude. I think you're taking chivalry for common courtesy, which is basically a privileging of women.
I just am more interested in more serious infractions. I really
How
don't
does
care
chivalry relate
if the guy
to patriarchy?
fails to open a door for me in the way that I
Is
would
that
be a
part
little
of
bit
patriarchy?
more annoyed if, for instance, I wouldn't be considered for a position of leadership because I'm shorter than your average CEO and don't have the proper body parts to
Right.
look like a
Okay, so
leadership.
there's a size
you
issue
know.
there. But I mean, in feminist theory, I mean, I guess I'm just asking. I mean, in feminist theory, if is chivalry antithetical to, are those women and children first? Are those kinds of things part of patriarchy, and that there's something that men are using to oppress women? I mean, is it like the high heels to keep her
I think
stilted up and then somehow dragging behind?
I think chivalry covers a lot of things, but I think that the reason why early feminists had a problem with it, and this is just my theory, and I don't speak as a feminist to be able to say what they think, but I think that it had something to do with people who, in public, demonstrated uh, generosity towards women in a kind of massive, major display, like, here, I will light your cigarette, here, I will open the door for you. But then once they got home, became kind of like lazy, go take my empty can because I'm not going to get up to, fetch me another beer kind of thing. So the problem with chivalry wasn't that they were treating women as fragile or extra special in public. It was that they weren't is that they weren't treating them like people in private as well. It was sort of a public display of the tenderness and delicacy of women.
I mean, that interestingly intersects, though, with the claim that women have a privileged, powered position in the private sphere, whereas men in the public sphere. I mean, that's kind of an interesting intersection.
Yeah, because a lot of times in the private sphere, women are doing a lot of work, and they are doing, but it's like I said, that you can't get all bean county about it, like with the equality issue. It's like Wendell Berry when he talks about why I'm not going to buy a computer. This was a while back, but he says he doesn't want to put his wife out of work, and she types up his manuscripts, and he published this article, and then a bunch of people said, "Oh, you like your wife to do your slave labor?" And he's like, "How do you know what my household is like? How do you know she doesn't like helping me with my work, that this is a meaningful thing for her, that we're kind of a little cottage industry between the two of us, and who are you to judge what makes for, if I type my own stuff, then where is she in my work life? This is part of our relationship."
Right,
and
right.
if, and some people can say, "Oh, well, she's oppressed because she's having to do this." Is she having to do this, or is she, is this part of her life? Does she want to do this?
Right.
The whole question of choice becomes very odd. I mean, do women choose to have children because they want to, or do they choose to have children because everybody encourages them to do it? Is this something that they really, where does the really want to do it come from? Does that come spontaneously from your own self? One of the things that TJ is very much of an individualist, and I appreciate that about him. But I think it's also difficult because it's also you forget how much you're shaped by the people around you and the expectations that they have.
Right. I mean, just to that. I mean, I agree with him, and I really do think the humanist argument. I can't remember the fun name that he had, but it was.
Well, individual was part of it.
Yeah, but this sort of I can't remember.
Humanist something or other.
A humanist something or other. Yeah, it was. But I think the issue, you had turned me on to Dorothy L. Sayers' book, Are Women Human? And just the question that a very sophisticated, woman who I would defer to as, obviously my intellectual superior could have to suffer a question like that. I mean, how could someone who is so brilliant have to actually ask a question like, can I think of myself as human, or am I not part of that group? To try to think of how people's self-understanding is funded by and sort of stands upon or rests in cultural presuppositions and all these kinds of assumptions. And I think, when people come into the world, they want to say, who am I and how does the world value me and how am I seen? And then they end up appropriating a subject position in terms of what they think other people think of them. And so, some of these dynamics, these sort of identity politics, I think they are caught in people's self-understanding, and it's not just what we do and what we don't have to do and who gets subjugated to what. It's about how do other people understand each other. It's sort of like, it's this dynamic of, this is how I see myself, this is how I see you, this is how I see you seeing me, this is how I see you seeing me seeing you. I mean, these kind of dynamics go on, and they get part of the culture. They become part of again, they're not really consciously chosen by individuals. I think they just become part of the ebb and flow of background practices that then, a movement like feminism comes along, or men's rights activists, and they're trying to bring into conscious awareness these things that then we give a label for, something like patriarchy or something like,
I think we probably have bigger problems at this point, there were different kinds of feminism. There's Marxist feminism, there's socialist feminism, there's separatist feminism, there's lesbian feminism, and each one of these makes different arguments. So I think that the reason why TJ got the backlash from his previous post was because the characterization of feminism was only one variety of feminism, only one group of people saw it that way, but there were other kinds of feminists. And there's, these days, I think in order to be, responsible, if you're going to call yourself a feminist, you'd have to be some kind of a human rights feminist. You'd have to understand that oppression happens to men and women. It happens to the poor. It happens, even rich people suffer. And to understand how they suffer might help poor people suffer less, because then the rich people would not be so oppressing and they would not use their money or their power in bad ways. You'd have to be able to really step, back and then step into and then step back and then step into all these different relations and understand the complexity of it, because it's usually not just one variable. It's usually not just the maleness and the femaleness of the thing, although sometimes there are certain issues like reproductive rights, like ability to vote in a culture where where voting elects your officers. There are certain kinds of things that are going to rally women around a cause.
Right. I always wonder what happens up with that issue of child, in custody laws and all this stuff in a fully libertarian society. Boy, all those questions, the domestic abuse questions for the libertarian, I think those are bees' nest. That's a real bag of snakes.
Well, it's hard to know how libertarian is a word that comes out your mouth.
I know,
and there's sort of communitarian libertarians who still want to have something else giving them the rules of the road, and then there's libertarians who are like, no rules from anywhere. And at that point, you could steal other people's children and eat them.
Right. Well, it takes the conversation, I guess, in a totally different way. But I think it forces the issue that some of those are very ambiguous, and because there does seem to be this question of, well, how men feel utterly disenfranchised because they can't have children. A man can't have a baby, So they're not equal.
They're working on it, though.
They're working on it. That's just, they're not equal, right? The point about justice rather than equality sort of comes home to roost in that problem of it takes a man for a woman to have a baby, and yet a man can't have a baby. It's a woman's. Well, whose is it? Well, is it part? They can't cut the baby in half. Yeah. They can't each have half a baby.
Well, Shulamith Firestone was a kind of a radical feminist, and she argued that technology was going to save us, because once we could have babies outside of the womb, there really would be equality between men and women wouldn't be doing the the labor, the reproductive labor of the species anymore, and so they'd be able to do labor alongside men, and then the only differences that would matter would be strength or height or whatever, or intellect, whatever was relevant to the job. But as long as the baby-making thing still lays largely under the purview of women, it leads to a certain amount of difficulty. And that's what Dorothy Sayers argued when she talked to this one. It was actually a speech, this little thing called Are Women Human? And she said, look, you shouldn't go for 50-50. It shouldn't be 50-50 everywhere. If there's one woman who wants to study Aristotle, then she should be allowed to do it. But that's, but not 50-50 necessarily, not necessarily, because a lot of other women might want to have kids, and that's what they'd want to do. And
if a guy wants to be a stay-at-home homemaker,
it's a very individualized argument that she's making, but it's a very difficult one for people to wrap their heads around, because the woman who's studying Aristotle or the man who's staying home taking care of the child is a minority. It's not is different, and she was just arguing in her Anglican sort of way that would be preferable to the kind of. She's not arguing against gender roles, even though she, had a degree from Oxford and, translated Dante's Inferno and had a child that she gave to a cousin to raise that she never acknowledged that she was the parent of. Life is complicated. And I think one of the mistakes that maybe that the 60s and 70s feminists made is that they wanted women to have it all. and they argued that women could have it all, that you could have a great relationship, you could have children, you could have the career, you could, do it all. And that men never had it all. They usually were pretty distanced from their children because they were so busy working if they were the breadwinner, and maybe they could manage the relationship. So, I have this chapter in this book I wrote called, 2 out of 3, where I'm kind of saying, look, maybe we should just cut women and men some slack and say 2 out of 3, that you do 2 out of 3 well, and we're not going to harsh on you for whichever one you bail on. Because if you try and do all 3, you're going to have to be on antidepressants, or you're going to have to be on 6 cups of coffee a day, or you're never going to sleep. You're going to burn yourself out. And if you have a community, hopefully what you don't do, someone else can do, and together you doing all of these things. But every individual trying to do it all and trying to be equal to the other individuals, it's very, very difficult to do all those things and to do them all well. Right. And if you don't do things well, you feel bad about it.
Right. Well, maybe we should end on there. Can I put a link to that? Do you have a link to that book?
I do.
Okay. Well, very good. Okay. Well, TJ, we enjoyed the video a lot. That was really great.
Yeah, it was fun.
And okay, have a good one. Bye.